Good morning. I'm David Wessel. I'm director of the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy. The Hutchins Center was formed 3 years ago now. This is actually our third anniversary, to improve the quality of fiscal and monetary policy and public understanding of it. And I think that this is actually a very good embodiment of what we had in mind when we started the Hutchins Center with a generous gift from Glenn Hutchins, a Brookings trustee, because we think that there's a role for research in both in shaping good economic policy and in helping the public better understand it. And certainly infrastructure spending and investment in human capital are one of those things that are two of those things that are often reduced to bumper stickers, sometimes with no evidence whatsoever behind them. I just want to say a word about the Hutchins Center. As of today, we have done 44 events. Today we will publish our 26th and 27th working papers. We've done 19 explainers, part of our public understanding, and we've produced one computer game called the Fiscal Ship, a game that helps to educate people on the federal budget, and there's going to be a laptop or an iPad set up outside if anybody wants to try it. But today we have a very simple question, but unfortunately not such a simple answer. So say you want to spend more money on public investment. That seemed pretty popular during the presidential campaign. Where should you spend it to get the highest return? And on what evidence? And so our attempt today is to get to begin with some discussion of the evidence and the arguments for public investment. Those of you who looked at the program know we're going to start with a keynote from Larry Summers, who, among other accomplishments, is co-chairman of the Hutchins Center Advisory Committee, to be followed by a conversation with Ed Glazer that I'll moderate. And then we have a panel of academics who I'll introduce later to talk a little bit more about the evidence on physical infrastructure. Then we'll turn to human capital. It was our belief that too often the conversation in Washington separates investments in physical capital and human capital, and we attempt today to bring them together into one thing. The other thing we've tried very hard to do is avoid advocacy for one particular form of public investment based on the interests of the people who are promoting it. There's an entire industry that's dedicated to telling us that we ought to put all of our tax money into pre-K, and another industry that's dedicated to no, we ought to put it all into roads and bridges. So we hope today to shed some light on the evidence for this and the arguments, and also the questions that remain to be answered. And because I think that we would be foolish if we pretended that all the questions had answers. Following the panel that I'll moderate, we're fortunate to have Kristen Butcher from Wellesley College, who will talk about the aspects of which transfer payments, particularly to low-income families, can be considered investment. Then we'll break for lunch, and we'll return with Sarah Turner, who will talk about education and what we've learned about research and education and the efficacy of that over the last few years. There's been a lot of work done. And then we're going to move to a discussion, I'll introduce the people later, about the politics and practicalities. It's a long day. I appreciate everybody coming on time. We are on C-SPAN and Huffington Post and the Brookings website, so be careful what you say, but not too careful. That applies to everybody except you, Larry. You don't have to be careful. There's coffee outside. The bathrooms are in the back. My colleagues here at Brookings would appreciate it if you when you get up, if you take the papers on the floor and put them in the recycling in the back. So with that, Larry Summers.
Thanks very much, David, and I am glad to be here and to participate in this event on what I think are a very consequential set of subjects. If you are looking for either predictions as to what will happen in the next several months in Washington, or you are looking for politically feasible judgments about what could happen in Washington over the next several months, my talk is not the one you should pay attention to. Instead, I want to do four things this morning. First, talk in a broad way about why I think infrastructure is so important. Second, make what I think is the overwhelming case for a program of expanded investment in infrastructure maintenance. Third, make what I think is the more speculative but still compelling case for a broader program of infrastructure improvement. And fourth, remark on the important role of markets, prices, and the like in improving the ways in which we invest in infrastructure. So, question one, why do I think infrastructure is so important and a compelling need in the United States right now? At one level, there are a variety of studies, which I suspect will be discussed in subsequent panels, that make a case that the return on infrastructure investment as conventionally measured is relatively high, at least compared to the government borrowing rate, which for the long term, in real terms in the United States, is now very, very close to zero. At a broader level, there are a set of economic observations that would suggest, to me at least, that conventional measures of rates of return are likely to understate the benefits of at least many categories of infrastructure investment. We know that more open trade generates economic benefits that substantially exceed any calculation of conventional deadweight losses. Perhaps because of the spur of efficiency from competition, perhaps because of the economies of scale from larger economic aggregates, perhaps from the greater facilitation of specialization. In the same way, we know in ways that are not predicted by at least the simple economic theories taught in basic courses that levels of productivity are much higher in the presence of substantial agglomerations of people than they are in the absence of such agglomerations. Again, evidence that bringing people together yields benefits. What does infrastructure do? Infrastructure permits, in substantial part, larger interchange and reduces effective distances, thereby facilitating trade and agglomeration. It would therefore be very surprising if the private benefits of infrastructure were not exceeded by the social benefits. I have wondered about this for many, many years since reading the work of Robert Fogel on the Transcontinental Railroad. The historians in general believe that the Transcontinental Railroad was central to the success of the American economy in the last third of the 19th century. That was the general view of historians. Fogel demonstrated that if you did a calculation and you said, well, transportation is X percent of GDP and the railroads are half as expensive as canals would have been, and you multiply the two numbers together, the whole thing could only have been 2 or 3% of GDP, and therefore the whole thing was not ultimately very important, and all the historians were wrong. Maybe. Or maybe Fogel didn't recognize and didn't take account of the various other trade-like benefits that were facilitated by the knitting together across the country that the infrastructure investment permitted. I suspect at least some of the latter. Second reason why I believe infrastructure investment is so important at both an economic and a broader social level is that in a world where most things are increasingly mobile, private capital almost completely, ideas almost completely, private companies enormously, a nation's infrastructure is distinctively local and is distinctively defining of its strength. That means that in an economic sense, an investment in infrastructure creates pull-in effects, attracting mobile factors from abroad to the more attractive infrastructure, rather than having benefits, the substantial part of which diffuse outside of our country. I also believe that at a time when we should, if we've learned anything from the last election, it is the importance of responsible nationalism. That the idea of a common infrastructure in which all Americans can take pride in its quality is a potentially important constitutive element of our nation. So I think there are a priori considerations for believing that infrastructure is profoundly important. Second, the case for maintenance, it seems to me, is overwhelming. The American Society for Civil Engineers estimates that extra burdens on automobile owners because of poorly repaired roads in the state of Massachusetts are about $2.3 billion, which extrapolates to over $100 billion for the United States as a whole. Depending on just how you do the calculation, it is between 50 cents and $1 tax on gasoline that motorists pay each year in extra automobile repairs because of poorly repaired roads. It is inconceivable to me that fixing that is not an investment with an extraordinarily high rate of return. Now, I have no idea whether the American Society of Civil Engineers has made that estimate with precision, whether that estimate is right to within a factor of 2 or not. But if it is even close to right, it surely makes a case for very substantial increases in maintenance investment. The same point, and this is not something that will easily be quantified with a statistical estimate, was made for me years ago when I was Treasury Secretary, and I, as was my habit at that time, every time I visited an American city, went and visited a high school and gave a talk about the importance of financial education and education more generally. And I gave such a talk. It was, I thought at the time, a pretty good talk. And a young teacher came up to me and said, Secretary Summers, that was a really interesting talk, but I'll tell you what I think the kids don't understand. And I said, what's that? And she said, well, you said that their education was the most important thing in the world. But the paint is chipping off the walls of all the classrooms in this school. And it isn't chipping off the walls at McDonald's. It isn't chipping off the walls at Walmart. It isn't chipping the walls off almost any other place except at the school. So why should they think that this society regards their education as the most important thing in the world. And I'm not usually at a loss for words, but I had no effective answer. But what I do know is that there are 10,000 schools across America where the paint is chipping off the walls. And I do know that on somebody's estimate, 20% of the chemistry labs in American high schools have HVAC systems that don't work, so the kids get sick when they do the labs. Now that can't be right. Now here's another thought. Fixing this is fiscal prudence. The evidence is, people have done these studies on delayed road construction, delayed road repair. And it's what you would think. Prevention is cheaper than cure. Waiting for the road bridge to collapse is much more expensive than buttressing the bridge before it collapses. Yet we have a set of measurement systems that measure with elaborate precision and require congressional approval on a periodic basis every time we increase the value of the dollar debt of the country. But deferred maintenance is every bit as much a debt burden on the next generation. It is one that accumulates and compounds at a much higher rate, and we have no mechanism for measuring it, let alone limiting it, let alone containing it. So, final reason why I think the case for more maintenance is compelling. I'm going to go a little bit over time here, guys, and that is that all of the incentives for all of the actors are against maintenance. Nobody ever named a maintenance project. Nobody ever got recognized for a maintenance project. Nobody ever much got blamed for deferring maintenance during the time while they were in office. And so all of the incentives are to defer maintenance and also to defer pre-maintenance. I learned this when I was president of Harvard. There were all these people running around saying Harvard should be more green and, we should just be more green and we should just make programs to be more green. And frankly, as an economist, I was not hugely impressed by this stuff. But then I learned a little more about it. And here's what it turned out happened in 2/3 of the buildings built at Harvard between 1990 and 2005. Somebody was in charge of the project. They had a budget. They were overshooting their budget. In part, they were overshooting their budget because they'd underestimated things. In part, they were overshooting their budget because the faculty wanted fancier laboratories or fancier offices or whatever. And so the budget was being overshot. And so everybody was mad. And what did they do? They took out at the last moment the insulation plans in order to save money. Well, they did save money. They got in under budget. Of course, they paid 20 cents a year in extra heating costs and air conditioning costs for every dollar they spent. So it was completely stupid in terms of the university's financial health, but the incentives there were overwhelming to do it. And if you don't think that's pervasive in infrastructure investment the public sector does across the country, I have a bridge that I would like to sell you. So I think the case is overwhelming that we should be spending substantially more on maintenance. How much? If you take that $100 billion a year in damage to automobiles, it's hard for me to believe that there wouldn't be a pretty compelling case for spending 0.5% of GDP more each year on maintenance, at least for the next decade, as we worked off a backlog. Third, there's more. The Treasury did a study or commissioned a study. I can't judge, again, the precise wisdom of the calculation, and the study was done by infrastructure advocates. But it emphasized that there were 40 projects across the country that cumulatively would cost about $200 billion and would, in present value, have benefits of somewhere between $500 billion and $1.1 trillion. I can't evaluate each of the projects. Here's one I think I know a little bit about: the air traffic control system of the United States. It is based on radar. I'll tell you three initials that have nothing to do with the air traffic control system of the United States of America. GPS. I've been banging on, some of you probably heard me say it, about JFK Airport and LaGuardia and how terrible they were, and how this made a case for infrastructure investment and how it's terrible. Well, eventually what I figured would happen did happen, which was that the guy who was in charge, the guy from the Port Authority, called me to try to get me to stop. And he knew, he was a shrewd guy, he knew that he wasn't going to get me to stop a good story unless he gave me a better story. And so he decided to tell me more than I knew about the air traffic control system. And he said, how does the air traffic control system work when it gets really congested over the New York area? He said, well, they do some of it on the screens, the radar screens, but there isn't actually enough capacity for all the green dots. And so there's another technology they use: thumbtacks, yellow stickies, and an oak bulletin board. This is the New York area, air traffic control, in what calls itself the greatest country in the world. That cannot make sense. The energy losses, because we do not have a sensible national power grid transmission system, do not make sense. The safety losses, because we transport energy on trucks and trains rather than through pipelines, do not make sense. It would not surprise me if there were substantial benefits to a sensibly designed national broadband program, though that is, I think, a less clear question. I am familiar with all these analyses about how mass transit doesn't work and how high-speed rail really isn't cost benefit given how spread out American cities are. I am. And in some cases, I'm sure those analyses are right. On the other hand, it's hard to believe that we are not awfully grateful that people built a subway in Manhattan 100 years ago. Hard to believe that we're not awfully grateful that that happened. And it seems to me when we think about our obligations to posterity in a world where things become much, much more costly to do, we need to recognize the creation of those option values as a value. So I think there is a strong case for a substantially more ambitious national infrastructure investment program, perhaps on the order of 1% of GDP each year going forward. Finally, what about the role of the private sector? What about the role of prices? The case for user fees, the case for congestion tolls is, it seems to me, an overwhelming one to anyone who thinks about the economics. There is no reason why people who use infrastructure more heavily should not pay for it. There is no reason why we shouldn't create infrastructure to the point where it yields benefits that are not to the point where it is fully used at a zero price. And so part of any comprehensive approach to infrastructure, it seems to me, has to be much more reliance on user fees. Part of any national strategy for for addressing infrastructure has to be addressing the effectiveness with which we publicly invest. That goes to questions of efficiency in procurement. That goes to the enormously burdensome systems of regulation. The bridge that some of you will know that connects Harvard Square with Boston is 362 feet long. It has been under construction now for repair, not construction, repair for 5 years. 5 years, as I gently suggested to the people in charge. Yes, this was a complicated reconstruction project. It really was a complicated project that had many different aspects to it. On the other hand, World War II was a complicated project as well, and it had only taken 3.5 years to win. And I noted that prior to the advent of more or less any technology, Julius Caesar had constructed a bridge across a 2,000-foot span of the Rhine in 9 days. And so their 5 years didn't look very good. And it is for political scientists more than economists to figure out how to solve this problem, but it is an immensely important one. Let me say finally, and perhaps Ed and I will have a chance to return to this, that I see no merit in the idea that using tax credits for contractors to implement infrastructure investment will address any of these problems. I called it somewhat inelegantly on television yesterday a Potemkin village of nothing. And I think it is a singularly poor idea whose principal effect will be to enrich those who are the recipients of the credits, in many cases for projects that would have been undertaken anyway, rather than to bring about a necessary infrastructure revival. Thank you.
Larry doesn't vote. Thank you very much. Entertaining as always. I'm still trying to get my head around the Potemkin village of nothing. One of the disadvantages of no longer being a full-time reporter at the Wall Street Journal is I no longer get to take a Larry Summers speech and turn it into a column and take credit for all his good ideas, although I have noticed, Larry, that we seem to have reached a point of inflation because I remember everything always had 3 points, and today you're up to 4. So I guess that has to do with the quantity of good ideas or something. But Ed, let me
for others to judge.
Ed, let me turn to you. Ed Glazer is one of Larry's colleagues at Harvard and has written quite a bit about this subject. I read a piece you wrote in City Journal a couple of months ago in which you said there were 3 popular propositions. One, that the 21st century business needs a 21st century infrastructure. Second, that infrastructure puts people to work. And third, that infrastructure should be a national responsibility financed by federal tax revenues. You said all 3 of those popular propositions were wrong.
Did I say the first one was wrong? The first one was wrong too? Well, I was on a roll.
Bad editing, I guess. So the floor is yours. Is Larry right or not?
Thank you. Yes.
But?
Yes, but just as America's infrastructure needs its full-throated advocates, it also needs its skeptics, because Americans are not going to get the infrastructure they deserve unless we both, propose it and then critique it and then argue over it. And I think that's, in some sense, what my job is. Although, quite honestly, I pretty much agreed with almost everything that Larry said. So let me go through it. And I think you may have missed the subtext of one of his comments, which is Harvard's economics department really needs a new HVAC system, and it's a great naming opportunity. So okay, the first point that I want to make is that I do want to be a full-throated advocate of a microeconomic rather than a macroeconomic approach to infrastructure. And the microeconomic approach is one that doesn't emphasize the sort of larger impact on economic growth, but rather looks at how many users there are going to be, what are the costs of the thing, what are we actually getting in terms of ancillary benefits. I think there are a couple of reasons, 3 to be precise, why the microeconomic approach has some real strengths. One of which is the magical thinking that can often come with this infrastructure is going to insert your locality here, Detroit great again, right, is that you get incredibly foolish things that would never have passed muster from a competent cost-benefit analysis, right? So Detroit's people mover monorail is, of course, the poster child for unwise infrastructure investment, and that never would have made sense if people were actually, counting bodies and trying to figure things out. Second thing, if you have a focus on jobs and macroeconomic effects, it leads to infrastructure in the wrong place. The places that need more infrastructure are largely America's growing, successful metropolitan areas. It's not West Virginia, right? It's not the Rust Belt. Detroit was built for 1.85 million people. It now has less than half of that amount. It is not Detroit that needs new roads. It is San Francisco. It is New York. Third, it pushes us towards the wrong funding model, okay? And here, I agree completely with Larry that the primary thing should be users should pay. It is an outrage that we expect voters and taxpayers in Montana to pay for the quite wealthy people who take New York's airports, right? And it also leads to misallocation of resources. But the more that we think of this as a national responsibility, it pushes us against the model that says, look, the real expectation is for most of this stuff, drivers should pay for their own roads. Now, second point is just on the user pay principle on this. I think it's very helpful if you have a user pay principle, both in terms of project evaluation, right? That in fact it leads towards better cost-benefit analysis if we're expecting by and large users should pay. There are cases in which this is not appropriate. There will be cases with externalities, in which case we need to find out the right subsidy model. Clearly, Larry is not a fan of tax credits, but we need something that comes in terms of if we think that these projects are going to yield large externalities from this. If we have a case in which it isn't an issue so much of externalities, but rather the average cost is actually way higher than the marginal cost, as in the case of some rail systems, there are creative funding models. And I'm a big fan, for example, of Hong Kong's mass transit system, which funds itself not with higher user fees, but by building skyscrapers atop new subway stops, and turns a tidy profit as a result. I'm not sure that I trust the New York's MTA to be engaged in this business, but something that ties more closely the property tax revenues near the infrastructure to the benefits, like tax increment financing, is not crazy. Third point, and again, I'm echoing what he said, but one of the biggest reasons we want to have user fees is to appropriately ration the access to the space. The right to drive on all of America's highways and streets freely was not written into the Bill of Rights after the Second Amendment, right? This is valuable space. There's no reason that it should be free for everyone. Singapore has GPS-based congestion pricing that they're working on. There's no reason that America should not have exactly the same thing to ration our space. Matthew Turner will hopefully say something about the fundamental law of highway traffic, which is a wonderful paper that he wrote with Gilles Duranton, which shows that vehicle miles traveled increase roughly one for one with highway miles built. If you build it, they will drive it. Okay, and there is, unless you actually use prices to ration, you just get more and more drivers on this space. I should push slightly back about there are cases in which transportation yields things that look like agglomeration. There are also cases, as in the case of the highway system, in which you end up de-agglomerating because of the transportation. So the work of Nathaniel Baum-Snow, for example, shows that each new highway that cut through a metropolitan core after World War II reduced the central city's population by about 18% relative to the rest of the metropolitan area. Point number 4, not only does infrastructure need to be paired with better incentives, it needs to be paired with the right institutions. So I want to also make myself a persona non grata in the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey on this, and I believe very strongly that just giving money to the Port Authority is foolish. In fact, it does the opposite of what we want to do, which is to get meaningful institutional reform, and I think almost surely in this case, it means breaking up this behemoth, right? It was a poster child for good government 100 years ago. It is no longer, and there's no reason why those airports can't be separate. In fact, it may well be the right answer to actually privatize some of those airports. Anyone who has flown recently from Heathrow to JFK may think that, in fact, the privatized Heathrow example is working a lot better than the public example in New York. But that's not a uniform answer, and private provision is not some panacea either. We have a long history of private providers of transportation in this country subverting local governments and extracting the rents from it, right? So all of the cautions around tax credits and tax credit abuse are correct. So there's a role for PPPs, but it's a role that needs to be monitored, that needs to be thought through. Eduardo Engel's work, for example, on PPPs globally, right, gives us a great picture of how PPPs can go drastically wrong in sub-Saharan Africa, even though they work in Chile. And you can make your own decision about where you think the U.S. falls between the institutional quality of Chile, which is high, and sub-Saharan Africa in terms of our ability to manage PPPs properly.
You want to take a guess where we are?
I leave that up to you, David. The institutional reform is also necessary when we think about Larry's comment about the Lars-Anderson Bridge. Larry's 5 years is actually misleading because there were another 3 years wasted in the planning process before you actually got to that. So in fact, it's at least 8 years is actually the right thing on this. Now, that's both about bureaucratic issues, but also about a planning process that reacted to perhaps the excesses of the Robert Moses era of megaprojects, in which we allowed a master builder like Julius Caesar to go ahead and build bridges across New York and did things that looked very unattractive in some ways. But on the other hand, he got things done and responded to this by saying, look, everyone's got to say at the table. If you want to argue about which bricks need to be brought in from Maine to make sure that this is historically correct, you have a right to sit at this table, and we want to hear your voice. You don't get things done quickly. That's not how World War II was won. And we need to decide whether or not we can tolerate a little less community engagement if we're going to speed this up. Obviously, I've been quite vocal about this community engagement also making America's cities unaffordable by making it too difficult to permit ordinary housing. Finally, point number 5, I think almost assuredly the highest returns are to maintenance, and this is an area in which almost assuredly this needs to be done with robust public financing, right? It's very, very hard to imagine how that we're going to do this with, at least with the current system, with user fees. I particularly like the model that the federal government gets more in the business of actually measuring and then tying Highway Trust Fund payments to maintaining the quality of these roads. But maintenance is job one. It is the most important thing. Now, there are new technologies where exciting things might happen. So autonomous vehicles make it possible to imagine autonomous vehicle lanes that are user fee financed that are incredible. So I think we shouldn't rule out big projects, but when I think about AV lanes, or even better, not even better, also autonomous vehicle truck lanes, dedicated trucks going on dedicated lanes running the big corridors, there's no reason why you can't imagine that this is going to be entirely user fee financed. Finally, I want to make a plea for the humble bus. Okay, buses are the forgotten children of American transportation, and yet they are the transportation that is often best tied to America's urban poor, to a category of people we should not expect to necessarily pay for all of their transportation. There's an old line that 40 years of transportation economics at Harvard can be boiled down to 4 words: bus good, train bad, okay? Now, and that's partially because there's not a lot that you can do with a train in an urban setting that you can't do if you have a bus on a dedicated lane, right? And bus rapid transit has been a big success in much of the developing world. And when you think about it, part of the beauty of the bus is that it's flexible, right? You can change the technology as the technology improves. You can make it autonomous. You can reroute the things. It has this great ability of adaptability, which is highly attractive. So let me just end by saying I really do agree with Larry, but I want to do so in as confrontational and as hostile a manner as I possibly can. So thanks for giving me the chance to do this.
Thank you. Larry, let me ask you, I want to ask 2 questions, and I'm interested in what you think about what Ed said, but first 2 questions. Once upon a time, not very long ago, you and others advocated for more infrastructure spending as a good way to put people to work. That was then. We had a much higher unemployment rate than we have now. Is that part of the argument no longer relevant?
Good question. So I think here's what I've kind of come to think about this. You can't do large amounts of infrastructure on and off in a usefully countercyclical way in any world that's remotely like the world of America today. The truth is that the Obama administration would have been delighted to have had the whole $800 billion stimulus program be infrastructure investment, that the number that was chosen for infrastructure investment was the maximum number that the technocrats would accept putting in a budget as remotely feasible. And it was, thanks to Herculean efforts by the vice president, was just about achieved in terms of spending in 2 years. Otto Eckstein joined the Council of Economic Advisors in 1962 and was very impressed by the amount of countercyclical spending that seemed to be going on all over Washington as things were being built, and thought it was really a huge tribute to the new Keynesian economics. And then he asked a few questions and learned that it was the countercyclical spending from the 1958 recession that was just kicking in. So turning large amounts on and off in substantial projects is not a feasible thing. Turning some on and off, particularly in the maintenance area, is a feasible thing and should be an important policy tool. There is also, I think, a legitimate argument, and I won't rehearse it in detail here, on the secular stagnation thesis, suggesting that demand shortfalls may be a much more pervasive feature of economic life over the next 20 years than they have been over the last 20. And to that extent, there is a case for a chronically more expansionary fiscal policy, which also relates to the fact that in a world with excess savings, there will be chronically very low real interest rates. And so I think there is a demand side case as well for more infrastructure investment. I think what should vary is less the quantity of infrastructure investment than the financing of the infrastructure investment. When things are strong, there should be a gas tax in place. When things are not strong, there is a stronger case for borrowing. So I think the balance of the argument has moved over time, and I think the demand side case is a more complicated one. But if Ed basically favors taking a 95-5 micro versus macro view of thinking about infrastructure, I would probably take a more 70-30. 70 micro, 30 macro view.
And where we sit today at the beginning of 2017, is this a time when we should borrow for infrastructure or finance it by tax cuts or tax increases or spending cuts?
I mean, you can't really answer that question apart from the context of what's going on in the rest of the budget. If the only major thing we were doing was substantially increasing infrastructure investment, I would be comfortable financing at least a substantial part of it with debt, because I believe the extra revenues that the supply side benefits of the infrastructure investment would generate would largely cover the debt burdens. In the context of what I wouldn't favor, but I think is likely to take place, which is trillions of dollars of tax cuts, I don't think there's room for trillions of dollars of unpaid for tax cuts and a very large infrastructure expansion, all financed with borrowing. Look, I think more generally, I mean, something that should be said is there is every reason in the world for the gasoline tax in the United States not to have been allowed to be cut in half in real terms over the last 30 years, as the congestion increased, as motor vehicle burden on highways increased, as the salience of carbon emissions increased, we should be taking much less regulatory and much more price-oriented approaches to encouraging energy efficiency than we are as a country. And a higher gasoline tax would be an early or a carbon tax would be important steps in that direction.
Ed, how do we decide where user fees are appropriate and where not? It seemed to me you mentioned two different situations. One is one where there are externalities, and so the society should pay for the stuff that the users don't pay for. I think that's pretty clear. But towards the end of your remarks, you talked about buses, and you implied, I think, that buses might not pay for themselves with fares, and there are clear distributional issues with user fees. I mean, they're sometimes derided as Lexus lanes, where only the rich people can drive in the low congestion lane. So how do you deal with that second thing, and how do you decide when it's appropriate and when not?
Well, there's an old line, I think it's associated with Marty Feldstein, which is, I don't actually need to know where the policy ends up, I just need to know the right direction of it right now. And right now, I feel pretty confident that we need more user fees rather than less. But let me be less trite than that. The case for buses being subsidized is, it's not a huge subsidy. It is targeted particularly to the poor. We already are doing it, and almost surely should continue to do it. If we wanted to experiment with higher prices occasionally, we can do that. But it seems risky on the bus front. In terms of congestion pricing on highways, the overwhelming issue is not the economics. Economists are sort of overwhelmingly on board on the advantages of having time-varying fees that try to ration the space. The overwhelming issue is the politics. And some politics of this is rational, as people who actually will be losers from this. There's a terrific paper by Jonathan Hall at the University of Toronto who actually shows a way that you can actually turn half of a highway, of a multi-lane highway, into a priced highway, and half you leave the same, so you actually do, for once in our lives, actually have a Pareto gain. Right, where actually everyone is held harmless through this. It's a very clever plan. That being said, typically people raise absolute hell over putting any form of congestion pricing in, whether or not it's rational or not. And remember, congestion pricing can be highly progressive in lots of ways. I mean, there's a reason why Red Ken Livingstone imposed congestion pricing in London, right? He wasn't doing it because he was a fan of rich financiers, right? He was doing it because he could tax the rich financiers driving and use it to subsidize buses. But the case where this is really doable is on new stuff. There's like an endowment effect that goes on with voters, which is if you show them a new highway that they've never seen before and say this one comes with a price, they shrug and say that's fine. If you take an existing highway that's always been free and slap a price on it, there's bloodshed in the street, right? So I think the case is whenever you get new highways, whenever you get new road capacity, price it, and whenever you get new technologies, right, like autonomous vehicles, establish the principle that autonomous vehicles are going to have GPS-based congestion pricing from the get-go, right? Justify it however you want, but get it into the system so that you can justify it by safety, you can justify it by any way, but get it in there so we establish this principle and keep it there.
Larry, one final question before I ask for a couple of quick questions from the audience. I've heard the story about this bridge over the Charles River before. I want to get a little specific. So if the Congress of the United States asks you, okay, we kind of agree that it's kind of ridiculous, it takes us forever to do anything. Tom Friedman once observed that the Chinese can build a convention center in the time it takes to repair an escalator on the Washington Metro. What specifically do you want us to regulate differently? Environmental regulations, Davis-Bacon, zoning? What do you have in mind?
I will answer your question, but I will tell one more story first. It was an education for me. I had a really good LaGuardia story going for a while, which was that some of you will probably remember this, which is if you go from the hallway where the shuttle flies into LaGuardia, and you go to baggage claim, or where you would get into where you would get a cab, there was an escalator. There was a sign on that escalator that was placed there on about October 20th, 2014. It said, escalator under repair, new escalator coming May 2015. So implying that it was a 6-month project to fix an escalator. This seemed like something out of Nehru's India, and I couldn't quite believe it. And I went to town with it and the ineffectuality of the public sector and all of that stuff. I did learn in my conversation with the Port Authority that that terminal was 100% privately owned by Delta Airlines, and that whatever my problem with that escalator was a 100% private sector problem. So I think it is a mistake to leap to the conclusion that the public sector always messes these things up. Look, I think we have to have less promiscuously distributed veto power in the society, and that is basically a different balance between popular participation and the imperative of moving forward with projects. There probably needs to be less recourse to the judiciary with respect to decisions that are made by elected officials, and there probably needs to be more recognition that non-governmental organizations, which are often viewed as the idealistic voices of the people, are often special interest groups as well, albeit ones not focused on the profit motive. I think the Davis-Bacon issues are quite separate from that.
You want to take a position on Davis-Bacon?
No.
I'm going to take 3 questions. They're going to be short because we have to get back on time. There's a gentleman there in the back, and then there's a woman here on the aisle, and a gentleman. Yeah, him. There's three right here.
Hi, George Friedlander. My concerns with all of this are a million, but I'll go to the 2 extreme ones. One is the problem at the federal level of project selection, which has never been solved sufficiently. When you have a federal role, and then at the state and local level, there's the problem of the political cycle, which is, if I do things on the cheap for now, I will get reelected. If I do what is really needed, it will be too costly, and I probably won't. And it seems a lot of it all seems to come back to return on investment. And nobody, I don't think, has figured out how you measure ROI on this.
Okay, so your first point is project selection, right? Okay, thanks. The guy behind you over there, yeah. Brittany?
Hi, Rick Rybeck, and thank you very much. I appreciated both of your comments about user fees. I'd be interested in your thoughts about what I call the invisible users. So there might be absentee landowners next to a new transit station or new highway interchange. They never use the highway. They never use the transit. They'll get a huge windfall in terms of increased land value from that infrastructure. Should they be paying in proportion to the benefit they receive?
Anna, there's a woman here on the aisle.
I'm Mitzi Wertheim. I come to this from a very different perspective, which is you need to educate the public. I mean, if you want to make it politically work, and it's very complicated, they have to understand it. Academics do not write for non-experts. They write in a very small circle. And if you want to get support for making these major changes, you need to write for non-experts. And anything that is a process, I would suggest you get illustrators to help you do it.
Okay.
We live in a much more complex world than when I was growing up. There are many more pieces. It's 1,000-piece or a 10,000-piece puzzle, and you always write about 3 pieces of it.
Okay, there's a very insistent woman over here, so I don't. I'm taking that the intensity of your hand raising means you have a very short question.
I think it's short and probative. On the subject of user fees, and not all users are equal, I wonder how much Amazon pays to maintain the roads for which all of its product deliveries are based. It seems to me that Weyerhaeuser out west will probably be using the roads in a state other than the one it's logging. I come from Wisconsin. Kimberly-Clark is a heavy user of the roads. So when you talk about user fees, where is the corporate as opposed to the individual user?
Okay.
Where are they plugged in?
Okay, so there's more questions we're going to have time to answer, so you get to pick which ones you want to respond to. Although, Mitzi, I want to say that your indictment of economists is correct, but these two are not guilty of speaking only to their peers.
Right, many of our colleagues think we should speak a little bit less to the general public and a little more to.
Okay, yeah, okay. So Larry,
Larry,
you want to start?
Companies pay user fees when they use the roads, and in fact, the ideal schemes tend to cause trucks to pay disproportionately relative to cars, and in sort of nonlinear with the number of axles, and that would very much operate in the direction you're saying. We try to reach broad audiences. We don't always succeed. Look, okay. I think maintenance is maintenance is the answer to some of this, because if you focus on maintenance, you're not going to do maintenance projects on things that nobody's using. The things you're going to naturally maintain are going to be the things that are extensively used. And so if you focus on maintenance, I think it tends to drive somewhat better allocation systems. I think the question of collateral rents, if I can call it that, is an interesting one. I'm told that the original mass transit systems were financed in part the way golf courses and ski areas are financed today. People developed them in anticipation of being able to sell the land nearby. This is an additional argument for property taxation, which is jurisdictions that do that will reap the benefits in higher property values as a consequence. But I think that is something that should be figured into the calculation.
Absolutely. I mean, I would even, so the property tax, or even more radically, land taxing, right? So taxing based on the land nearby, and the increment in value seems like the right way to handle the incidental beneficiaries. I want to make a political point, though, about maintenance. So it's not just an issue that maintenance is the right answer a lot of the time. It's the politics is part of what is pulling away from maintenance, right? You get a lot of new press for a new project, right? So if you're a politician, you like the new project open. You don't get a lot of press for maintaining the HVAC system in the school, even though it's probably more socially valuable. So one thing we can think about doing is, trying to shine more light on maintenance efforts. And that's one of the roles I think that can be really positive for the Federal Department of Transportation, is regularly publicizing maintenance efforts that are going on and where maintenance efforts are not going on at the local level, and again, tying financing to it. And again, just to come back, because it was raised, Larry's point on the axles is exactly right? That in fact, I can remember once having a conversation with a public official who was a big advocate of public spending for infrastructure, and his line was, look, I just want the guys to be able to ship through Chicago without sitting in traffic for an hour and a half. And I stared back at him and said, I want them to get that too. I just want them to pay for it, right? And that's really the point, that we all want a better infrastructure for America. We do in fact want a 21st century infrastructure for 21st century America, regardless of what I said. But in fact, what we want is it to be done wisely, and we want most of the time the people who use it to pay for it.
Thank you both. Oh, Larry?
What this conversation is making me realize is somebody should, with some methodology, for every city, every major city, and every state, do a calculation of annual maintenance neglect and rank them. And if there was, it'd be like the poverty line. It's not that the poverty line isn't questionable in a whole set of ways, but the fact that there is a poverty line focuses attention on poverty in a way that it never was focused on before there was a poverty line. If there was a annual deferred maintenance burden, it would generate attention on this, and people wouldn't want to be at the bottom of the list. People wouldn't want to be subject to the attack ads, and it would be something that somebody entrepreneurial could start, like the Brookings Institution, David, could start to.
I got the message.
Could start to generate.
Ed's already got an app on his phone.
I got an app for that. Yeah, no. So, and there are great new technologies like Street Bump, which actually, if you put this thing in the cup holder when you drive around the streets of Boston, it will actually report to city government where there are potholes. Right. So we've got stuff which can be combined with economic analysis to be a fantastic product for Brookings.
Great, thank you. With that, please join me in thanking Larry and Ed.